समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है, अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है, अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
I will talk a little bit about semiconductors, and I will also refer to you some links that you can use if you want to understand a bit more on these subjects. In fact, if you go to the description with this episode of Cut the Clutter, you will find a bunch of links there where you have experts explaining what semiconductors are, how do they work, how is one semiconductor better than the other, what is it, what is the race about right now. So all of that stuff is there. I will tell you the basics, and I will also tell you about the challenges that India has had in making semiconductors, why India does not make any semiconductors despite the fact that India is a semiconductor powerhouse globally. Now that's a contradiction. I know that I've got you interested by saying this to you, and I will explain to you what that means. I will also tell you about one particular story that I chanced upon while reading up on semiconductors. That a particular story of how India tried to jump into the semiconductor race very early on, as early as in 1983. And that is something, that's an effort that did go some distance and then was cut short cruelly. How it was cut short is a dramatic story. And I can tell you, and I can confess to you that because I was a very active reporter at that time, maybe at that point I was doing something else, or maybe at that time we never figured that it was such a significant story. But when I look back now, I can see that something happened on February 7, 1989, which killed India's dreams of having semiconductor plants or becoming a semiconductor power in its own right. That we'll talk about as we go along. Now, first of all, what are semiconductors? So my dumb question, why are semiconductors better than conductors, right? That's because conductors conduct everything. If you connect a source of electricity with a copper wire with the bulb comes on. You do it, maybe put a bottle in the middle, the bulb will not come on because the bottle is a poor conductor. In fact, a glass bottle is a non-conductor, right? At the same time, you have substances which are not quite insulators as say glass or maybe rubber, but also not such good conductors as say copper and aluminium. Silicon is one of them. Now silicon, because silicon is a bit of this and a bit of that, it conducts a little, it's a semiconductor. That silicon then enables you to put other stuff on it. I'm now oversimplifying it like hell. That silicon then allows you to paint it electronically in such a way that you can put a lot of what used to be called transistors. At one point you can still call them that. So a lot of these high electronic patterns can be printed on it, which can then direct current and energy in the way you want. Again, this is oversimplification in the extreme. And then as technology has progressed, these have become lighter. You need them to be lighter so they can fit into smaller devices. Look at this phone that you carry. This phone has so much computing power now because these wafers of silicon have now become so sophisticated. The science with them has become so sophisticated and so micro that you can put a lot of electronics onto them, a lot of circuitry onto them, even though their size is very small and very thin. That's why they are called wafers. In fact, they are so thin that their thickness is now mentioned, or thinness is now mentioned in nanometers. What is a nanometer? A nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. You want to understand how thin or how small a nanometer is? So a human hair is like 90,000 nanometers. So a human hair is like 90,000 nanometers. A red blood corpuscle in our blood is 7,000 nanometers. It looks very micro, but 7,000 nanometers. A virus, you might think nothing can be smaller than a virus. So virus is 14 nanometers, 4 nanometers. An RBC is 7,000, human hair is 90,000, a virus is 14, 1/4. Even that is too thick for today's latest microchips, although 14 nanometer microchips are being now used for artificial intelligence and machine learning. Those are very small, but once again, go lower down on the scale of size. A strand of DNA is 2.5 nanometers. The latest that IBM has produced is just 2 nanometers. It is less than a strand of DNA. Now, when you can put your messaging, electronic messaging at so micro a scale, think of how much you can put in a tiny chip that will go into this phone, that can go into a missile system, that can go into a submarine, that can go into a nuclear launch pad, that can go into a big computer, a solar cell, etc., etc. That is how computing power now is being packed in very small sizes on chips of very small sizes to fit into very powerful devices. That is the whole business of semiconductors and microchips. Once again, if I have oversimplified it, I apologize to you, but to expect me to do something in a more complex manner would be expecting too much. Now, you might say, what is silicon? I explained to you what is silicon. It is a semiconductor. It is not as impervious to current as, say, a bottle of glass or rubber. It's not as good a conductor as copper, so you can play with it. You play with it by putting impurities in it. So essential skill and essential process to making semiconductors is to introduce impurities in this silicon. Impurities in the silicon, that process is called doping. So you dope that silicon based on what exactly you want to do with it, and then you process it. And I'm again jumping many steps. What then happens is, once you've got the wafer ready, then you've got to put the stuff on it. You've got to put the brain on it, and that's where the miniaturizing and the printing comes in, and that's where the craft or science of photolithography comes in. What then happens is that lithography, calendars are made through lithography, right? You say, oh, I bought 10 lithographs of such and such painter. So lithography is a science or a process where image to be printed is ink receptive and the blank area is ink repellent on a flat surface. Exactly the same process takes place when it comes to printing electronic circuitry on a wafer, on a silicon wafer. Again, the more precise your circuitry is, the more sophisticated your science is, the more you can pack onto one wafer, on a thin wafer, on a small wafer. Of course, you can have a big wafer also. Bigger wafers have been made, wafers going into 18-inch diameters have also been made, but the bigger they are, the thicker they will have to be, right? Because otherwise they will crack under their own weight. That's why miniaturization is the key to everything. How much miniaturization matters? See these couple of pictures. This is a picture of 5 megabytes, 5 MB of computing power being loaded in early days of the computers. 5 MB of computing power. See how much it is. How much of an effort it is to load that. Those days computers used to be humongous, with lots and lots of wires into them. They were like humongous pieces of machinery. I'm not taking you back to the 50s when the first computer system came in an Indian media organization, that was India Today, in the mid-80s. I used to work there. It was called the ATEC system. Then a room twice the size of this room had to be separated for the mainframe to be installed there. That was, I think, 1988, 1989. So you can see this, if 5 MB of computing power required so much weight and space, a phone like this has 256 GB of computing power. Kahan pe 5 MB, kahan pe 256 GB. 1 GB, by the way, has 1024 MB. So multiply 2056 by 1024. That much computing power is packed in this device. In fact, it's very easy to pack a lot more. If somebody is willing to pay the price for it, a new model will have twice as much, thrice as much. So that is what microchips and semiconductors have done, to not just to the electronics industry, but to our lives. The problem with India is that we Indians are very good at designing these semiconductors, which means we can write circuits. We are very good at designing what needs to be put on these wafers, but we are not good at making wafers. We've never made wafers, and that is why when our engineers, and we are not short of engineers. In fact, if anything, we have among the best engineers in the world and a lot of engineering manpower. When our engineers make these designs, these are not converted into semiconductors in India. These are then sent to Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, America, and indeed China, to be then printed on semiconductors, on wafers, and then we import those. What is our import? In 2019, our imports of semiconductors or these chips were $21 billion. It's going up at 15% every year. India, for example, now is becoming a very powerful and a sizable manufacturer of mobile phones, smartphones. All of those smartphones, all the automobiles we manufacture, we are also a major automobile manufacturing power. All of those require these chips, and all of these have to be imported. It's a big burden. It's also a shame that while we are so good at designing these, we are not good at all in manufacturing these. So once again, because it's an entirely new universe for me also, and engineers amongst you, please forgive me if I get something wrong, or if it sounds like I am saying something too obvious, because most of us are not engineers, right? In any case, many of us were not particularly smart at physics or math. So couple more terms or couple more bits of semiconductor glossary I need to mention to you as we go along. So companies that only design, the companies that only design semiconductors, these could be a lot of companies in India. These are called fabless. Why they are called fabless, I'll tell you in half a minute. Companies that only manufacture, those are called foundries, right? Foundries, they're not foundries like steel foundries, iron foundries, but they're called foundries. Companies that do both. So one set of companies figure out what to put on the wafers. One set of companies only makes dumb wafers, then you put intelligence onto them. The companies that make wafers but also put logic or computing power onto them, those are called integrated device manufacturers or IDMs. India has strength in the first but not in the next two. Why is the first one called fabless? Because companies that make these wafers, they are called fabrication units, fabricators, and then over time they've just come to be called fabs. That's the reason very often when you see stories about semiconductors and they say, oh, India has a fab unit, the fab will come up, fab will not come up, when are we going to get fabs? I also used to wonder what those fabs are about. They are basically fabrication units for these semiconductors. Now, as I had mentioned to you earlier, India actually had foreseen this chip business much earlier than we imagined. It was in early 80s. Mrs. Gandhi was still in power that India decided that India had to also get into the business of making semiconductors. That was also the time that under Carter first and then under Ronald Reagan, Americans and their allies had brought in a very tough export control regime for high technology. So they were not willing to export anything to any country. It was at that time that Mrs. Gandhi decided to set up India's first semiconductor plant. Now take your mind back to 1983. Somebody decides to set up an Indian semiconductor plant in 1983. That is 40 years back. That's a lot of foresight. But the biggest challenge was India was then a victim of a very tough export control regime. So the Japanese had also joined the American-led regime. This was called Coordinating Committee on Multilateral Export Controls, or COCOM. Yet Mrs. Gandhi decided, her electronics secretary and her scientific advisor then was Ashok Parthasarathi, who was the electronics czar of India for many years. So under his leadership, she decided to set up a company called Semiconductors Complex Limited in 1983, 40 years back, only to make semiconductors. There was some discussion over where to locate it. Chennai, or Madras as it was called at that point, was considered to be much more suitable location. But this is the time when Punjab had all this trouble. Gyani Zail Singh was president of India. He also wanted help in Punjab by locating some more industry there, creating jobs there. So Mrs. Gandhi decided to locate this unit in Mohali. Mohali was then coming up as an industrial hub. As it turned out, it probably wasn't the best choice, because if you read a book that I would recommend to you, it's a book called Midnight's Machines, published in 2019, written by Arun Mohan Sukumar, who was one of my young colleagues in the Indian Express, then went out to do other stuff and wrote this brilliant book for which he got the Ramnath Goenka Award as well. That book tells us, also explains as to why this wasn't the best choice, because Chennai or Madras at that point also had a much greater and much more readily available supply of math and engineering human resources, which Punjab at that point did not. Nevertheless, this unit was set up there. It started functioning, and we know more of the story from a very concise podcast by a man called John Y, Jon, John Y. So thank you, John. John Y runs this podcast, brilliant podcast called Asianometry.com out of Taipei in Taiwan. And he tells us, look, India was always a big power in designing these chips, but India never made them. In 1960s, he said, Fairchild, American company, it tried to set up a semiconductor unit in India, but got scared off by Indian bureaucracy. Because you know what? Indian bureaucracy, particularly Indian bureaucracy in the 60s, did not particularly welcome foreign investment. There was a great deal of wariness and suspicion of foreign investment. So instead of coming to India, they got scared off with India. They located their plants. They wanted plants in Asia, so they went to Malaysia and the Philippines instead. But in Mohali by 1984, Mrs. Gandhi decided to locate Semiconductors Complex Limited in Mohali. By 1984, it was functional, or parts of it were functional. It was also the area in which a couple of other Punjab government electronics companies were located. So Panwire, for example, Punjab Wireless, it was called Panwire, or Punjab Communications, or PCL. They also made very good recruitment from IITs and Indian Institute of Science, etc. That's what John Y tells us. He also tells us that any semiconductor plant or semiconductor business or enterprise needs four things. Financial capital, it consumes a lot of money. Number two, human capital. It needs a lot of very skilled people. Number three, government to provide infrastructure. And fourth, manufacturing technology. So first three were available in plenty because Mrs. Gandhi and the government then had really put its weight behind the project. Manufacturing technology was the problem, and India went searching for it. Most countries said no. Most Western countries said no. Even the Japanese were hesitant to give India anything because, as I mentioned to you, they were already signatories to the American-led Coordinating Committee on Multilateral Export Controls, or COCOM. But India still tried to do a few things and succeeded in reaching the 5 micron level in the first phase. So 5 micron level in the first phase, they did some more stuff. Then they got to 0.8 micron level. 0.8 micron level would be called 800 nanometers. I told you that the latest that IBM has produced, the smallest right now, is 2 nanometers. So India got to 800 nanometers, which John says took India to a level where they were one generation behind the cutting edge at that point. And it was possible that India would be able to cover that distance maybe in the next 10 years, because that's how long it takes. But it was a very good beginning, and then something happened. I told you earlier on that something happened on 7th of February 1989 to devastate India's dream. The SCL unit, the Semiconductors Complex Limited unit in Mohali, caught fire. It caught a most destructive fire. It was completely destroyed. It was destroyed so thoroughly, and a semiconductor unit, when it catches fire, also releases a lot of noxious gases and then sets you back by many years. So it cost a lot more money. It was only in 1997, after 8 years, that the plant was revived. By that time, the semiconductor market in the world had moved on. New players had come in. Samsung, for example, the Taiwanese had risen in a big way, and India was left really far behind. You might ask me what happened to SCL then. SCL, after a while, by about 2005, ceased to be a commercial company or ceased to do commercial work. It has now become a lab. So SCL has now become a semiconductor lab. And how and why of that fire? Was it a pure accident? A lot of these semiconductor plants have fire accidents because these are processes which are fire prone. At the same time, this was 1989. 1989 was probably the worst year, 1989, worst years in my memory as a journalist, in my journalistic career of 40 plus years for India's national security. This is when terrorism in Punjab was at its peak. Militancy and terrorism in Kashmir had just started in 1989. This is when our relationship with Pakistan had really gone for a toss, and the Western world was also hostile to India, at least to the extent of technology denial. It was in that period that this marvelous unit, this really invaluable unit, caught fire. So there were rumors at that time that maybe this was sabotage, maybe this was deliberately done. Also because SCL was doing a lot of stuff for the Defense Ministry, for India's armed forces, also for the missile program, also for Department of Space, but nothing eventually got proven. In fact, if you start researching on it, you find very little detail on it. So I thought, just when we were talking about semiconductors, ruining the fact that one big plan, the Foxconn Vedanta plan, had come unstuck right now, and talking about semiconductors in general, I thought it was also important for me to share this fascinating story with you of how India took this initiative, made this brave beginning 40 years back, despite massive technology denial from the West, basically the countries that had these technologies. It was denied to us, and yet India tried this, and how this was destroyed or devastated in very mysterious, unexplained circumstances in 1989.